I'm Kocher. I'm the author of Hell Done, a popular novel available on Amazon. Today, we are in New York City's Central Park, behind the Metropolitan Museum of Art at Cleopatra's Needle, an Egyptian obelisk brought to New York City in 1880 and installed here. It is by far the oldest man-made object in Central Park. What is an obelisk? It's an ancient Egyptian billboard meant to remind the Egyptian people of the divinity of their pharaoh. This obelisk was carved from red granite about 3,500 years ago. So what does that really mean? Nowadays, if you tell someone that isn't a history professor or an archaeologist that something was carved in 1450 BCE, it really doesn't mean much. They don't have a frame of reference. So let's talk about the origin of the obelisk. First, let's get the common name Cleopatra's Needle out of the way. Obviously, it is not a needle, and Cleopatra lived 1,400 years after it was erected. Cleopatra was the last Egyptian ruler of the Ptolemaic dynasty. She was descended from one of Alexander the Great's generals, and was a ruler of the classical age, not of ancient Egypt. The name Cleopatra's Needle is a news headline made up in the 1800s when there was a popular craze about Egyptian history, and Cleopatra became a cult figure in the popular imagination. As for the obelisk itself, it is from the same planet as we are, but from a different world. It can be hard to wrap your head around time, but try it this way. The Great Pyramid at Giza was built about 4,500 years ago. This obelisk was carved about 3,500 years ago. Okay, so where does that place it in commonly known history? Well, in common Western education, the average person is taught that at the end of the Bronze Age, great events occurred that resulted in the beginning of the era or age we live in today. The most commonly known of these events are the Trojan War and the Exodus from Egypt led by Moses. It's thought that both of these events took place approximately 1250 to 1200 BCE. So think about that. This obelisk was on display for 200 years before Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt, or Hector fell before the walls of Troy. This obelisk was on display to the citizens of ancient Heliopolis, modern Cairo is today, and stood in front of the Royal Academy, where the elite went to school, including the princes of Egypt. In ancient times, it would have had a polished pink surface, shining and smooth, with the hieroglyphics clearly defined. The capstone at the top was sheathed in gold. The obelisk was carved and installed at Heliopolis, the city of the sun, during the reign of Thutmose III, the sixth pharaoh of the 18th dynasty. This is important because Thutmose III was ancient Egypt's greatest general and military commander. The obelisk has a cartouche that honors Thutmose, but it's worn off. 1,400 years before Caesar, 1,100 years before Alexander the Great, there was Thutmose III, remembered now by Egyptologists as the Napoleon of ancient Egypt. Thutmose was born in 1481 BCE and became pharaoh while still a very young child. He ruled for 53 years, although it's true that for the first 20-something years of his rule, his stepmother Hatshepsut ruled on his behalf as regent. Thutmose was raised to be a general and came to power in his own right in 1458, and then led military campaigns until he died in 1425 BCE. During his reign, Egypt became an empire that extended north to what is today Turkey and east to the Euphrates River and Mesopotamia, the widest area that the Egyptians would ever dominate. 1 year into his own rule, he began his military campaigns. You have heard of his most infamous military campaign. We all have, even though we don't realize it. In 1458 BCE, Thutmose led his army north into what is today Israel, to the city of Megiddo. Warlords from countries dominated by the Egyptian Empire had banded together to rebel against Pharaoh. After a battle and a 7-month siege of the city, he won what is considered by historians to be the first great military conflict that was reliably documented. It was the first recorded battle involving massive armies, daring tactics, and heavy casualties. and the scribe of Tutmosis III wrote it all down. In other words, it was the first great battle that everyone heard about, and the one that created a prediction of the future and a myth to go with it. You know it as the myth of Armageddon, the battle at the end of time. All the stories, movies, and predictions that you have ever heard about Armageddon in biblical history and modern culture result from the documentation of this first great battle. For 1,400 years, the obelisk, actually one of a pair, stood in Heliopolis. Then in 13 BCE, the first Roman emperor, Augustus, had the pair of obelisks installed in front of a temple to Caesar in Alexandria, in a further bid to convince the Roman Empire in Egypt that he was the legitimate son of Julius Caesar. The one link Cleopatra may have had to the obelisk is this. It is said that she had a great interest in the mystical past of her country, and that she had ancient artifacts dug up. By her time, the obelisk had already spent centuries buried in the sand. She may have had the obelisk moved to Alexandria while she was involved with Julius Caesar. But in 54 BCE, Julius Caesar was assassinated, and she became involved with Mark Antony. They had great ambitions to rule the Eastern Empire together, but Cleopatra and Mark Antony lost the civil war to Augustus' forces at the Battle of Actium. Egypt was annexed by the Roman Empire, and Cleopatra committed suicide, bringing a close to the history of ancient Egypt. This is how Augustus would have taken charge of the obelisk and used it to promote his own rule of Egypt. So that is the world this granite obelisk we see before us is from. But how did it get here? The obelisks remained in Alexandria until the 1870s, when the Ottoman viceroy to Egypt, the man who governed Egypt on behalf of the Ottoman Empire, Khedive Ismail Pasha, offered this obelisk as a gift to the United States to commemorate the opening of the Suez Canal. It was politics. The Ottoman Empire knew the Western countries loved to acquire artifacts from Egypt and other ancient cultures. After the Civil War, New York City became an economic powerhouse, but lacked culture, and city leaders wanted respectability like the great European cities. An opportunity to have an obelisk like Paris and London was not to be missed. Actually, the London obelisk is the mate of this one. They stood in Heliopolis together and then in Alexandria until they were moved to the west. The whole operation was financed by William Henry Vanderbilt, the son of Cornelius Vanderbilt, the railroad tycoon, and the man who built Grand Central Station. William Henry Vanderbilt spent over $100,000 to move the obelisk across the Atlantic Ocean. That's well over $3 million today. In 1879, the obelisk, which weighs 220 tons and is 71 feet tall, was loaded onto a special ship in Alexandria Harbor named the Cleopatra and crossed the Atlantic Ocean to Staten Island. In 1880, the obelisk arrived in Manhattan and 96th Street in the Hudson River. For months, it was dragged through the streets by special horse-drawn wagons across the west side, through Central Park, to Fifth Avenue, and then back to this spot. Soon after, 9,000 Freemasons marched up Fifth Avenue to celebrate the event. On January 22, 1881, the obelisk was set into place here using a special block and pulley system. It was an especially cold day, but New Yorkers came out to watch. Several time capsules were placed under the base containing a Bible, a map of New York City, a copy of the Declaration of Independence, an 1870 census, a Webster's Dictionary, and other important documents of the time. There were other mysterious items included associated with the Freemasons. It is said that William Henry Hobart, a Freemason, put a small black box into the time capsule, and that no one knows what was in it. And it's still in there. It's still down there. Today, the obelisk is cared for by the Central Park Conservancy, but they face a substantial challenge in attempting to preserve the obelisk of Tutmosis III for the future. Remember, it was carved and then stood for thousands of years in a dry climate. It was already damaged from hundreds of years of wear when it was moved to Alexandria, possibly by Cleopatra or Julius Caesar 2,000 years ago. But then in 1880, it arrived in a climate with changing seasons and annual freezes and thaws, not to mention pollution and acid rain. By 1885, it was apparent that the New York weather was damaging the ancient stone. An attempt was made by the city of New York to preserve the obelisk. 800 pounds of granite chips were stripped from the obelisk, and it was coated with a clear paraffin wax to preserve the color. Unfortunately, the wax faded the pink from the granite instead. And in just 140 years or so, the granite has worn down to the condition we see today. One thing we can learn from the history of the obelisk is that despite the beliefs of the ancient Egyptians, nothing does last forever. However, understanding and appreciating the ancient world can give us a more exciting perspective on our own legacy as humans on this planet. Visit the ancient obelisk in Central Park. Thank you for watching. I hope you found this video enlightening. My novel Hell Done is available on Amazon.